I still remember the sound of that phone call. It was 2:37 a.m. when the ringtone shattered the silence of my room. For a few seconds I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard her voice. My daughter, Skylar. Trembling. Broken. Mom, please help me. In that moment, every instinct in me came alive. I didn't need to ask questions. I didn't need explanations. I had spent 34 years as a judge, listening to victims, decoding fear, and recognizing truth. And I knew. That kind of fear can't be faked. I threw on a coat, grabbed my keys, and drove through the empty streets. Every red light felt like an eternity. I kept replaying her voice, those two words, help me. I had heard that tone in courtrooms, in shelters, in the eyes of women who had lost all hope. But hearing it from my own daughter, it pierced something deeper than any gavel I had ever dropped. When I arrived at the precinct, I saw her sitting there. My Skylar. Pale, shaking, eyes swollen from crying. And beside her him. Darius. Her husband. Clean shirt, neat hair, fake wound wrapped dramatically in gauze. He looked at me with that smug calmness I had seen in countless defendants, the look of a man who believed he could twist the system to his will. That night I wasn't just a mother. I was a storm waiting to break. He spoke first. She attacked me, he said, loud enough for the officers to hear. She's unstable. You know how she gets. The room tilted for a moment. I could see it in their eyes, the confusion, the hesitation. The polished man with a bandaged arm and the trembling woman beside him. It was a story they'd heard too many times, always told by the wrong person. I stepped closer, my voice calm, controlled. Where's Captain Cole? I asked. One of the younger officers pointed down the hall. I knew that name. Cole, an old colleague from my early days on the bench. I walked straight past the desk and pushed open the office door without knocking. He looked up surprised. Estelle? What are you? Don't, I said. Not tonight. I told him what I saw, what I knew. That my daughter had bruises. That this man, Darius, was manipulating the narrative before the truth could speak. Cole tried to keep his composure, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Friendship clouded judgment, and Darius was counting on that. But I had spent too many years watching predators hide behind charm. I wasn't going to let it happen again. The neighbors have nothing to do with this, Darius snapped. Oh, but they do, I replied. Because they've heard the screams, the begging, the crashes through the walls. And tonight they'll speak. He froze. Just for a moment, but it was enough. The mask slipped. Cole tried to intervene. Estelle, this isn't a courtroom. Then maybe you should start acting like it is. I cut him off. Because if you process my daughter without a full investigation, I will personally make sure your name never sees another badge again. The silence that followed was thick, electric. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder. Cole finally nodded, defeated. Miles, he called to the young officer. Take Miss Hayes to the hospital. Full exam. Photographs. Everything. When Miles left, Darius laughed bitterly. You're overreacting. She's lying to protect herself. Lying? I asked, stepping closer. Then how do you explain the burns on her back? He went pale. He hadn't expected me to know that. How do you know about that? He stammered. I smiled, not kindly. Because I know my daughter. And I know women like her always leave evidence. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in months. Jordan, I said when my eldest answered. Come to the 10th Street precinct. Bring the flash drive Skylar gave you. There was silence on the line. Then a sharp intake of breath. Mom, how do you know about that? Because she trusted you to keep it safe, I said softly. Bring it. Now. Darius's expression cracked completely. What flash drive? He demanded. The one with the recordings, I said evenly. The one she made every time you hit her. Every time you told her no one would believe her. It was a bluff. But the terror in his face told me I was right. Cole sat back in his chair, finally seeing the man behind the lies. "Darius," he said quietly, "you might want to call your lawyer." Minutes later, the door opened. Officer Miles returned. "Captain, the ambulance is here. The paramedics say Ms. Hayes has visible trauma. Bruises in different stages of healing, possible fractured ribs, ligature marks on her wrists." Each word landed like a gavel strike. Darius slumped into his chair, his perfect world crumbling in real time. And then came another voice, a woman from the hallway. "We heard the call on the radio," she said. "We live next door to Skylar. That man's been hurting her for months." Behind her stood another neighbor, nodding in silent agreement. Their words poured out like truth breaking through years of silence, the screams, the nights of fear, the lies. Cole finally raised his hand. "Enough," he said, voice shaking. "No one's leaving until every statement is taken." Darius's mask shattered completely. "You're all against me," he spat. "She's manipulating you." "No," I said quietly. "I'm exposing you." That night, justice didn't come from a courtroom. It started in a precinct office, with one mother who refused to look away. The drive home that night was long and heavy. The rain tapped against the windshield like it was echoing every heartbeat I tried to silence. My hands gripped the steering wheel, trembling, not from fear but from fury. How had I missed the signs? I had raised Skylar to be strong, independent, confident. She had inherited my sharp eyes, my stubbornness, even my quiet pride. But behind that strength, she had been suffering. And I, her mother, the former judge who had seen through every lie in a courtroom, had failed to see through one in my own home. When I pulled into the driveway, the house felt foreign. The ticking clock, the framed photos, the smell of lavender candles. Everything felt like a museum of my ignorance. I walked to the mantel where Skylar's graduation photo stood. She looked radiant that day, wearing her cap slightly tilted, her smile stretched wide. But now when I looked closer, I saw it, that same faint tightness in her jaw. The same one I'd seen tonight. The mask she had worn for years. I sank into the armchair and let the tears come. Not the soft kind, the kind that shake your body and empty you completely. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like a judge. I felt like a mother who had been asleep while her child was being destroyed. Morning came too soon. My eyes burned from sleeplessness, but I knew what I had to do. Skylar was at the hospital under observation. Darius was detained, temporarily. But temporary wasn't good enough. When I arrived at the hospital, she was sitting by the window, her arm in a sling, face pale but calm. She smiled when she saw me. "Mom," she whispered. That one word nearly broke me again. I sat beside her, took her hand, and for the first time since she was little, she didn't try to hide her tears. "I thought you'd hate me," she said, "for letting it get this bad." I shook my head slowly. "Hate you? Skylar, I hate myself for not seeing it." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I could feel how fragile she'd become, like a porcelain figure held together by sheer will. But beneath the fragility, I sensed something else. A spark. A quiet defiance that hadn't been there before. "I'm pressing charges," she said. "And I'm not backing down." For a moment, the old judge in me stirred. "Good," I whispered. "Because he picked the wrong family to underestimate." The next few days blurred into paperwork, phone calls, and endless interviews. Reporters hovered like vultures. Darius came from a well-known family. Respected, wealthy, untouchable in their own eyes. But I'd seen powerful men fall before. I knew the system could bend, but it could also break if you applied the right pressure. I met with the district attorney, a young woman named Lena Cho. She'd once been my intern. Now she sat across from me with fire in her eyes. "Judge Hayes," she said, "I read the reports. I believe your daughter. We'll go all the way with this." "Good," I replied. "Then don't call me Judge Hayes. Call me Estelle. Today I'm just a mother." She smiled faintly, and for the first time in days, I felt something resembling hope. But hope, I learned long ago, always comes with a cost. That evening, a black car parked outside my gate. A man in a suit stepped out, holding an envelope. He didn't say a word. Just handed it to me and left. Inside was a letter. Short. Precise. Withdraw the complaint, or your family's past becomes public. I stared at those words until they blurred. The past mine. The one I'd buried decades ago. There was a case years ago, one that never made it to trial. A powerful man had hurt a young girl. I'd fought to put him away, but the evidence had vanished, and my integrity was questioned. Rumors spread. They called me biased, emotional, unfit. I'd kept quiet back then, choosing dignity over defense. But that silence had haunted me. Now they were threatening to use that same scar against my daughter. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Fear tried to creep in, but something stronger pushed back: rage. The next morning I called Lena. If they want a war, I said, we'll give them one. I'm done being quiet. She hesitated. Estelle, are you sure? They'll dig deep. They'll use your past. Then let them, I said. Because this time I'm fighting for my daughter. And I'm not the woman they silenced 20 years ago. That night I went to the attic and pulled out a dusty box labeled Old Cases. Inside were files, photos, transcripts, and one journal. My handwriting filled with details that had been ignored back then. I smiled bitterly. Maybe it was time the world remembered what real justice looked like. By the time the trial date was set, the entire city was watching. The courthouse steps were lined with cameras, microphones, and faces pretending to care. But inside those walls, it wasn't a spectacle. It was a battlefield. Skylar stood tall, her cast gone. Her bruises faded but visible in her spirit. I sat behind her, not as a judge, not as a strategist, but as her mother, her witness, her anchor. When Darius walked in, he looked smaller. Still polished, still arrogant, but diminished. His lawyer whispered furiously beside him, waving documents that meant nothing now. Then Skylar took the stand. Her voice trembled at first, but with every sentence it grew steadier. She spoke of nights filled with fear, of the lies, of the pain, and then of the moment she decided to survive. When she looked at me mid-testimony, our eyes met. For a heartbeat it felt like the world stopped. That was my daughter. No longer a victim but a force of truth. And for the first time in years I felt peace creeping in. Not victory. Just peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop running from your own silence. The courtroom felt colder that day. Maybe it was the marble walls. Maybe it was the ghosts of 1,000 verdicts echoing through them. I'd spent most of my life in rooms like that. But this time the gavel wasn't mine. And the stakes were personal. When Skylar finished testifying, there was a silence so heavy it could have drowned a heartbeat. Even Darius's lawyer looked shaken. But he recovered quickly, predators always do. He stood up, walked to the center, and began his game. Mrs. Hayes, he said, voice silky, isn't it true that your mother, the Honorable Judge Estelle Hayes, was once accused of misconduct in a domestic violence case? My pulse stopped. Skylar looked back at me, confusion written across her face. He had gone there. He smiled. Perhaps it runs in the family, the tendency to dramatize abuse. The judge slammed his gavel, but it was too late. The words had been said. The poison was out. I felt my daughter's pain turn to fury, and in that moment I knew we were not backing down. When she spoke again, her voice was firm. My mother taught me that silence protects monsters. So no, I won't be silent. Not for him, not for anyone. The courtroom held its breath. I could have sworn I saw one of the jurors wipe a tear. That night, the headlines exploded. Former judge's daughter takes the stand in abuse case. Estelle Hayes' past resurfaces. Every word was a dagger, not because it hurt my reputation, but because it reminded me how cruel public judgment could be. I sat on the couch, the television flickering with talking heads debating my integrity. Skylar came and sat beside me, curling up quietly. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. After a while she looked at me and whispered, "Was it true? What they said about that old case?" I hesitated, then nodded. Yes. I fought for a girl who had no voice, and they called it bias. Skylar's eyes softened. "So you've been here before?" I smiled sadly. "Yes. But this time I'm not alone." She took my hand. "Then let's finish this together." In that moment I realized something profound. Justice isn't about courts or verdicts. It's about the people who refuse to be silenced, no matter the cost. The second week of the trial brought the defense's witnesses, colleagues, friends, even a pastor who painted Darius as a good man who lost his temper. I'd seen this performance 100 times. Polished lies wrapped in scripture and sympathy. But the truth, the real bleeding truth, has a way of surfacing when least expected. Lena called the final witness. "Your Honor," she said, "we'd like to present a recording recovered from Ms. Hayes' personal cloud account." The defense objected, of course, but it was admitted. The room dimmed as the audio played. It was Skylar's voice, trembling, pleading, and Darius's response, cruel and sharp. The room froze. Every word cut through the illusion he'd built. By the time it ended, you could hear nothing but Skylar's soft sobs echoing from the speakers. Darius tried to speak, but his voice faltered. His facade collapsed under the weight of his own cruelty. For the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of losing control, but of being truly seen. The verdict came on a Thursday. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. I could hear the faint creak of wooden benches, the rhythmic tapping of a pen against paper. When the foreperson stood, I held Skylar's hand so tightly that our fingers ached. "On the count of aggravated assault," the voice read, "we find the defendant guilty." Time stopped. Skylar gasped, covering her mouth, and I felt my knees weaken. The words echoed in my mind like a song I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. Darius's lawyer slumped. Darius himself just stared forward, stunned. For the first time he wasn't performing, he was powerless. Skylar turned to me, eyes filled with tears. "It's over," she whispered. I shook my head gently. "No, sweetheart. It's just beginning." Because healing, I knew, doesn't come from a verdict. Comes from what you do after. From learning to breathe again. After the sentencing, we stepped out into the sunlight. The cameras flashed, questions flew, but for once I didn't care about the noise. I cared only about the woman beside me, my daughter, my reason, my redemption. She stopped at the top of the courthouse steps and took a deep breath. "I feel lighter," she said softly. "Like I can finally breathe." I nodded. That's what truth does. It breaks you first, then rebuilds you. For weeks, she'd been terrified to face the world. But now, as she faced the crowd, I saw something unbreakable in her. She wasn't the trembling woman from that precinct anymore. She was a survivor. That night back home we sat in silence. No words, just shared peace. I looked at her and realized, she didn't just inherit my eyes or my stubbornness. She inherited my fight. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to change everything. 2 weeks later, we returned for the sentencing. The courtroom felt different, quieter, heavier. Darius sat at the defense table, handcuffed, eyes hollow. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. Defeat. Judge Sterling read through the findings, voice steady, almost gentle. But the words were merciless. "For your repeated acts of violence, manipulation, and coercion," he said, "this court sentences you to 25 years in state prison." There was no reaction from Darius. No plea, no tears, just silence. The kind of silence that follows when someone realizes their power is gone forever. Skylar exhaled, trembling. I reached for her hand, and in that touch, years of fear dissolved. For so long, she had lived in the shadows of his control. But now the light was finally hers. Outside, reporters swarmed. I watched Skylar stand before the microphones, her voice soft but unshakable. "To anyone listening," she said, "you are not alone. Justice may take time, but it comes. And when it does, it frees you." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to listen. The months that followed were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Skylar moved into a small apartment on the third floor of an old brick building. It had wide windows that let in morning light, the kind of light that fills a room with life. I helped her paint the walls a soft cream. Jordan brought plants. We laughed, got messy, and for a few hours forgot the past. One afternoon, as we unpacked, Skylar found a box labeled Dreams. Inside were her old-fashioned sketches, faded but beautiful. She looked at them for a long time. "I thought I'd lost this part of me," she said. "You didn't lose it," I told her. "It was waiting for you to come back." That evening, she sat by the window sketching again, lines flowing like whispers of freedom. I watched her hands move, graceful, sure. It was the first time in years she looked like herself. Sometimes justice looks like a courtroom victory, but sometimes it looks like a woman rediscovering her own laughter. 6 months later, Skylar called me. "Mom, can you come over? I have something to show you." When I arrived, she was glowing. On the table lay a set of papers, the official divorce decree, signed and sealed. She handed them to me with a trembling smile. "It's done," she whispered. "I'm free. Legally, emotionally, completely free." I hugged her. She melted into my arms, all the weight she'd carried for years finally lifting. "I'm proud of you," I said softly. "You turned pain into power." She laughed through tears. "I didn't just survive, Mom. I'm living again." She showed me her new journal, filled with notes for a book she was writing. "Aisha thinks it could help others," she said shyly. "It's about how abuse hides behind charm, behind control. How we ignore red flags because we want to believe love will fix everything." I placed my hand over hers. "It will help more than you know." And in that moment I realized her healing had become her mission. Jordan joined us that weekend. She brought coffee and laughter, the kind that fills a home with warmth. She had news too. Captain Cole, the officer who once ignored Skylar's plea, had been suspended pending investigation. "Finally," Jordan said, half smiling, "the system's cleaning house." Randall Quinn, Darius's lawyer, had also been stripped of his license for concealing abuse cases. One by one, the pieces of the old system, the corrupt, the complicit, were falling. It was justice, but it was also accountability long overdue. That night, as the three of us sat on Skylar's balcony, the city glowed beneath us. We watched the sun dip behind the skyline. The air felt different, lighter, honest. "Do you think it's really over?" Skylar asked quietly. I looked at her, at the woman she'd become. "No," I said. "But the worst part is." She smiled, understanding. "Healing doesn't erase the scars. It teaches you to live beautifully with them." That night, I drove home under a soft drizzle. The streets shimmered like liquid gold beneath the streetlights. I thought of everything, the fear, the courtroom, the verdict, the rebuilding. When I got home, I made myself tea and sat by the window. My reflection looked older but not weary, just real. For decades, I'd handed down sentences, believing justice was something written in ink. But I understood now. Real justice lives in the moments after the gavel falls, when someone begins to heal. I thought of Skylar sleeping peacefully for the first time in years. Of Jordan's courage. Of the women still trapped, still scared. And I whispered a silent promise to them. "You're not forgotten." 'Cause sometimes the system fails. But mothers don't. The true protectors never do. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and felt peace. Not the peace of victory, but of survival, of knowing that love, persistence, and truth can rebuild even what evil tried to destroy. Months passed and life found its rhythm again. Skylar's apartment became a place of color and laughter. The walls that once echoed silence now carried music, conversation, and the gentle hum of healing. Sometimes I would visit her on quiet afternoons. She'd brew coffee while sunlight poured in through the wide windows, painting golden streaks across her floor. We'd talk about nothing and everything, her work, her book, the small joys that made her smile again. I watched her hands as she spoke, steady, alive. There was a strength there that words couldn't capture. She was no longer the frightened woman begging to be believed. She was a survivor rebuilding from ashes. One day she looked at me and said, "I never realized how strong I was until I had to be." I smiled, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You always were, Sky. You just needed to see it." Healing, I learned, doesn't come with fireworks or applause. It arrives quietly, in laughter shared over coffee, in mornings that don't begin with fear. Skylar's book began to take shape. She called it Unseen Chains. It wasn't a story of revenge. It was a story of reclamation. She read me a passage one evening. Abuse doesn't always start with bruises. Sometimes it begins with a voice that says, "You're lucky to have me." Sometimes it starts when you stop recognizing your own reflection. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I saw myself in them, all the women I tried to protect in courtrooms, all the ones I couldn't save. I realized something I'd never admitted out loud. For all my years as a judge, I'd carried guilt, the kind that doesn't fade with verdicts or time. But hearing my daughter speak her truth helped me release some of it. Because now her voice, her courage was reaching others. And maybe that was the justice I'd been chasing all my life. Not punishment but transformation. Not silence but stories that heal. Jordan's visits became a tradition. Every Friday evening she'd bring dessert, and the three of us would sit on the balcony watching the city breathe. She once said, "It's strange, isn't it? The same world that broke us can also heal us if we let it." That line stayed with me, because it was true. Healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about walking through it, hand in hand with those who refuse to let you fall. I often thought of the other victims, Chloe, Danielle, the women whose courage built the foundation of our case. They were rebuilding too. Starting businesses, studying, speaking out. One by one, they were reclaiming their voices. And as I watched the city lights flicker, I thought, maybe that's how justice truly works. Not as a single moment in a courtroom, but as a ripple that keeps spreading, reaching others still trapped in silence. One night I found myself awake, unable to sleep. I stood by my window, listening to the rain tapping gently against the glass. I thought of that call at 2:37 a.m., the call that changed everything. The fear in Skylar's voice. The fury in mine. The strength I didn't know I still had. I realized then that everything I had learned in 34 years on the bench meant nothing compared to that single moment as a mother. Because no law, no verdict, no statute could ever capture what it feels like to fight for your child's life. And yet, this wasn't just about my daughter. It was about every woman who's ever been doubted, every voice dismissed as overreacting, every survivor who had to prove her pain to be believed. So I made a quiet vow that night to keep speaking, not as Judge Hayes, but as a mother, as a woman, as a witness to what happens when love refuses to give up. Sometimes I still visit the courthouse. I walk those marble halls, listen to the echoes of gavel strikes, and remember all the faces, victims, survivors, warriors in their own right. Justice isn't perfect. The system breaks. But people, especially women, have a resilience that defies everything. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Silence protects no one. Truth, no matter how painful, saves lives. And love, fierce, unyielding love, can rebuild what cruelty tried to destroy. So if you're listening to this and you feel trapped, unheard, or broken, please know this. You are not alone. Speak. Reach out. There are hands waiting to hold you, even in the darkest night. Because justice doesn't only live in courtrooms. It lives in the courage to speak, the strength to heal, and the power to begin again. And maybe, just maybe, that's where true peace begins.